Comments made on the following paid commercial program are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time.
Welcome to the Money and Wealth Show. On the program this week, tax tips with David Ingram, money commercials, and our special guest, BC Finance Minister Colin Hansen. Welcome to the Money and Wealth Show. I'm Sterling Fox, and our special guest this week is the Honorable Colin Hansen, the Minister of Finance for the province of British Columbia. Minister, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here, Sterling.
Last week on the program, we had the former Premier of BC, Bill Vander Zalm, on talking about the HST and his FightHST.com campaign. Minister, we invited you or your boss, the Premier, to appear to present the government side of the story after hearing the forces of nay. What is it about the HST that singularly is best for British Columbia?
Well, I think it's actually all about job creation. And it's actually one of the reasons why 130 countries around the world have already shifted to this type of a value-added tax. It's one of the reasons why Ontario made the big decision that they're going to go to a harmonized sales tax effective the same date, July 1st.
Right.
And it's, as all of the leading economists tell us, it's the single biggest thing that we can do as a province to stimulate the economy and create jobs.
Okay, now, by creating this HST taxation environment, it is said that this will benefit most big business through capital investments in machinery and infrastructure, and that investment allows business to grow, which allows the demand for employees to grow. A sort of a trickle-down effect. Have I interpreted it correctly?
Well, I think you're partially right in that, but the exception I would take is that this benefits all companies, all employers, and it makes it easier for them to be able to afford either to grant pay raises or to create more jobs in the province. Because right now, I think one of the misconceptions that people have is that somehow when a company pays PST on something, like a new computer or a truck or whatever it is, that somehow they don't then pass that cost on to consumers. In reality, all of the PST that's paid by big companies, little companies, regardless, they pass that PST cost that they have to pay onto their consumers at the end of the day. So, you know, it's not a case of whether companies pay this or consumers pay it. Today, consumers are paying it.
How will the rules change, though? Because my understanding, Minister, is that some businesses will be able to claim back the entire 12% of the HST that they're investing in specific categories. Is that true?
Yeah. So, you know, let's take an example of a logging operation in northern British Columbia, where the logging contractor has just gone out and bought a new pickup truck, and he would have paid 5% GST on that. He gets that rebated from the federal government, all the GST that they pay. He would pay probably 10% PST on a pickup truck that's, if it's valued over $55,000, or 7% if it's under $55,000. But that PST, he has to build into his cost of doing business. So it gets passed on, and eventually when you go down to the store to buy a 2x4 to build a fence this weekend, you're going to be paying not just the 7% sales tax, provincial sales tax, but you're also going to be paying for that embedded PST that all through the value chain, whether it was the logging contractor or the sawmill or the distribution company, at every stage in the life cycle of that 2x4, there is PST paid by those companies, and they have to build it into the price.
All right, so let's use that pickup truck and say it's over 50 grand. It's a real nice unit. Is the cost, the taxation cost, which is added to the price of the truck to the purchaser, is that completely refundable to that business under the new HST regime?
That's right, and that's the way value-added tax systems work. So our existing provincial sales tax, they refer to it as a cascading tax, so that you wind up with a tax that gets embedded at every layer. It's almost snowballs, because then you wind up paying tax on tax as it snowballs through the value chain, as they refer to it, or their production cycle and retailing cycle and distribution cycle. But under value-added taxes, what happens is that the companies still have to pay the 5% federal portion, the 7% provincial portion, for a total of 12%. So that doesn't change.
At the point of transaction.
At the time that they buy things.
All right.
But they then can get that rebated from the federal government through, so that they don't have to build all of that tax into the eventual consumer price. So not only is that a big benefit for you or I wanting to go down to the lumberyard to buy a 2x4 for our fence, but it's also a big benefit for exporters. Like when you think about the fact that, we've had huge increase in our exports into China of dimensional lumber. Like a lot of people think it's raw logs, less than 10% is raw logs, over 90% dimensional lumber. But we're competing against the Scandinavian countries in China, and they have a 25% value-added tax. But I can tell you there's not €1 of that tax is built into their export price. So they can compete in the Chinese market much better than our lumber companies can. That costs us jobs.
Okay, I want to come back to the forest industry and other sectors of the British Columbia economy a little later in the program, because there's lots to talk about in that area. But let's back to the HST and the gas pumps. Let's use that as an example that we can all relate to, because most of us feel, Colin, that when we buy a tank of gas, we're paying all of the provincial levies, and in the Lower Mainland and other municipalities, there's a transit levy in there as well. There's tax upon tax, and then to add insult to injury, there's GST on top of all of that. How is the HST going to play out at the pumps?
The 7% incremental portion of the HST will not be applied to motor fuels. They will be exempt. So, and that's not the case in Ontario. So in Ontario, where BC and Alberta differ, there's lots of differences in how we're implementing this, but one of the big differences is that Ontario is going to apply their additional 8% tax to gasoline and other motor fuels, and they will also apply it to home energy costs, so your natural gas or electricity or whatever you use to heat your home.
Right.
In British Columbia, there will be no provincial 7% portion of HST on home energy costs or on motor fuels. That's a big difference.
Was that a deal you had to negotiate with the feds, given that Ontario has one set of rules at the pump and BC has another? You both have deals with the Government of Canada on this HST. Was that a stipulation in the original negotiations between Canada and BC?
Well, it's actually one of the reasons why, like, we've looked at HST every year. It comes up in discussions, and should we do it, shouldn't we do it? The federal governments, whether they're federal Liberal or federal Conservative governments going back to the mid-1990s, have been encouraging provinces to adopt the HST. The Atlantic provinces did, actually, in 1997. Quebec developed their own value-added tax system in the early 90s. So we've looked at it, but one of the reasons why we resisted it is because of the lack of flexibility. The federal government wanted one rate from coast to coast, and in today's context, that would be a 13% rate.
Right.
They would not have allowed British Columbia to have only a 12% rate, which is what we're going to have. The other big change that they made last summer was that they allowed for more flexibility around the goods that would be taxed. So they allowed provinces, and this was new again just last year when Ontario negotiated it, they allowed provinces to have unique exemptions up to a maximum of 5% of the tax base.
Okay.
So what we did in British Columbia is we exempted books, we exempted children's size clothing, booster seats, car seats for kids, things like that. But we also exempted motor fuels.
Okay.
That was the big one. And that used up all of our flexibility. What they did in Ontario is they exempted books and children's size clothing, that same list. The difference being they didn't exempt motor fuels. They exempted basically quick service restaurant meals valued under $4. So if you were going to go to Tim Hortons and have a coffee and donut, you would, in Ontario, you will not be, well, today in Ontario, restaurant meals are already subject to provincial sales tax above $4. So what they did is they used their exemption room to grandfather in this under $4 exemption for food services.
All right, lots more to come here. We're talking about the HST, which, like it or not, you and I are going to start paying on the 1st of July this summer. Our guest is the Minister of Finance for the province of British Columbia, the Honourable Colin Hansen, here on the Money and Wealth Show. We'll be right back.